Welcome to the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training's virtual diplomatic lunch discussion. My name is Mark Rincon. I'm an active duty Foreign Service officer with ADST, and today I'll serve as a moderator for our discussion. So as part of ADST's mission to capture, preserve, and share the history of America's diplomats, this series features policy experts and authors who've had a connection with ADST or who have written books with ADST. We encourage you to learn more and to join us at adst.org. We're delighted to have Ambassador Hank Cohen with us. He served 38 years in the US Foreign Service, and in Africa, he was posted to 5 US embassies. He served as ambassador to Senegal, amongst other assignments. He also served in Washington, D.C., where he was the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs under Presidents George H.W. Bush. And he also served as a Special Assistant for African Affairs to President Ronald Reagan. So he has much experience. Among his many honors, he has received the French Légion d'honneur and the Belgian Order of Leopold II. Since 1994, Ambassador Cohen has worked with an international consulting firm specializing in assistance to American corporations doing business in Africa. So it's an endeavor that's continued with him even in quote-unquote retirement. He's the author of several books, including Intervening in Africa, Superpower Peacemaking in a Troubled Continent, which is a book that received the American Academy of Diplomacy's 2000 Douglas Dillon Award for best writing about diplomatic practice. So Ambassador Cohen, as an expert and as a practitioner of diplomacy with deep experience, you've been tracking US policy in Africa for decades. In examining this history, you've noted that the US has a bit of a mixed record, some successes, some failures. So in addition to that, given the increasingly polarized nature of politics, especially today, very few US politicians who currently take a bipartisan interest in Africa are looking for new ideas. So one of the questions we have today is, where do we go from here? We would welcome your thoughts on US policy towards Africa, and we look forward to the update and to have a good discussion as well. So again, we welcome questions throughout the presentation, and Ambassador, I will give you the floor.
Thanks very much, Mark, for that very generous introduction. Let me begin with a bit of a historical perspective. We really didn't take much interest in Africa until the Second World War for a couple of reasons. First of all, there was geography. With German occupation of Europe, we had to use Africa to go to the Middle East and the Far East. My own brother was in the war, and he transited from Louisiana to India via Accra. So there are all sorts of airfields in West Africa that we built up, or we even started. I was traveling in Mauritania a few years ago, and I ran into an airfield, and I looked at the sign, and it said, built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So geography was very important to us. Secondly, the Belgian Congo had this wonderful mine that gave uranium, and this was the uranium that supplied the US nuclear program that resulted in the nuclear weapon. And because of that mine, we sent troops to the Congo to guard the mine, to keep it functioning. And we built a major airfield there called Kamina, which is still one of the best airfields in Central Africa. So it is not a surprise that what the African countries started to become independent in the second half of the 1950s, that President Eisenhower, who had been the supreme commander during the war, took an interest in Africa. And he said, let's debate what is our policy going to be. And he had some discussions in the National Security Council, and there was a heated argument between John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State, and Richard Nixon, who was the Vice President. Dulles was a Cold Warrior. He says the Cold War must be dominant in our policy toward Africa. Either you're with us or you're against us. That's the approach we should have to each independent country. Richard Nixon who had traveled considerably in Africa, he took the opposite view. He said, let's not bring the Cold War into Africa. the Africans are getting out of colonialism. They don't want to join any bloc. They want to be neutral. Let's recognize that. So President Eisenhower opted for the Nixon point of view. He said, let's keep the Cold War out of Africa. And I've seen a quote in one of the Security Council documents saying, Eisenhower saying, we must win their hearts and minds. And so we started out with a policy of leaving out the Cold War, but concentrating on economic development. Excuse me. And I remember when my first post in Africa was Kampala, Uganda. It was still a consulate. I was the administrative officer, and I got an instruction: prepare for 10 USAID families who were going to arrive in 6 months. So clearly, the emphasis was on economic development. The problem was that we really didn't know what to do. We had done well in the Marshall Plan because the European countries had the infrastructure, they had the industries. It was just a question of providing funding for them to repair everything. But Africans, in Africa, we were starting from scratch, and we really had no firm idea of how to proceed. And also, the Africans at the beginning caused a lot of their own problems by taking the advice of their colonial mentors, who were the French socialists and the British Labour Party. These two parties were engaged in massive nationalizations in the UK and France. All the banks, the insurance companies, the big mines, the industries, they were all being nationalized in those days. So they said to the Africans, you nationalize everything that's important, and that'll bring about economic development. So the Africans said, if you're doing it, we'll do the same. So they went after the banks, the insurance companies, the plantations, the light industries. However, while the British and French were running their companies for profit-making and reinvesting, the Africans saw this as a vast opening for employment. So thousands of people came in from the rural areas and got jobs in these nationalized industries. I remember Uganda, where I was. They had Uganda Airlines, which was a good airline. They had 3 airplanes and flying all over East Africa, but they had 5,000 employees. And this was repeated in all of the nationalized industries. So they had to subsidize these industries, taking money away from infrastructure, healthcare, education. The economists have a term for that. It's called crowding out. So by keeping these industries, these enterprises going with vast employment, they crowded out all these other vital things. So they started out on the wrong foot. Now, between the time of independence and 1975, the Africans could afford it because commodity prices were very high. I remember when I was in the Congo, a pound, 16 ounces of copper sold for $1.50. That was a very high price. But in 1975, there was a collapse of commodity prices worldwide. And the Africans found themselves subsidizing all these nationalized companies with much less revenue. And this was the beginning of Africa's economic crisis and made it much more difficult for us to help them with their economic development. So we were looking for all sorts of ideas. And of course, we were getting criticism from Congress. Every time we came up for an appropriation, people like Senator Helms, who was chairman of the African subcommittee, he would say, it's money going down a rat hole, all this money you're giving to Africa. So we needed new ideas. President Nixon said, well, why don't we only give aid to the countries that can really make it? You know, he called them concentration countries like Cameroon, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Africa, what have you, the bigger countries. Well, he tried that for a while. He didn't get much result. And then when President Clinton came in, President Carter came in, he said, well, let's start something new. We'll call it basic human needs. Let's help the poorest of the poor. And I remember when he said that, I was chief of mission in Senegal, and I got together with the aid director, and I said, how can we implement this? So we had 2 ideas. One was, the Africans want to grow vegetables, you know, so they can sell them and feed themselves. Let's dig water wells all over Senegal. And we dug 500 wells, and that was a popular program. And then we found that another big problem was infant diarrhea. Lots of infants were dying because they couldn't handle the diarrhea. So we set up what we call health huts all over the country. We had 3 people: somebody who was an expert on infant diarrhea, how to stop it; someone who was an expert on mosquitoes and malaria, who could get rid of standing water, and there was someone who was able to manage all of this and collect money, like $1 every time someone came into the office. And for every 20 of these, we had a place where an African mother can go give birth. So these were not economic development projects, but they were popular. They were popular. Okay, so also the Africans had what they called the one-party state. They decided early on that multi-partyism that they inherited from their European colonialists didn't work for Africa. It was too argumentative. People were insulting each other from different parties. So they decided to have what they called a one-party state, where they could talk things out, go sit around the baobab tree and work out things. And but that didn't work either, because at one point the state, the party, became more important than the state. And there's a lot of money going into the party, a lot of corruption. And so the one-party state didn't work. So toward the late 1980s, many of the African governments said, we're going to go multi-party. We were going to go multi-party. And we were quite happy with that, and we were ready to assist them. When I was Assistant Secretary of State, we were the first US administration to provide democracy programs. And we started out in Mozambique. We had been doing it in South America for decades, but this was the first time we were doing it in Africa, promote multi-party democracy. And more governments were accepting that. Okay, then there was the challenge of white minority rule in Southern Africa. And there, I'd like to give a lot of credit to Henry Kissinger for starting the process of pushing the white Southern Africans to end white minority rule. He saw that there was a growing movement within the United States to start doing something about white minority rule. The reason for that is that the South African government had to use more and more repression. So many of the South African Black youth were out there demonstrating, and the South Africans really were clamping down on them. And this was getting publicity in the United States. So Henry Kissinger said, we got to do something about this. And he persuaded the president of South Africa, John Vorster, to put pressure on the white Rhodesians to start the process of going back to legality and ending white minority rule. And this was the beginning of the Lancaster House Conference in the UK, which ended during Jimmy Carter's administration, which led to the majority rule in what used to be Rhodesia and became Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. Okay, so what about apartheid in South Africa? That was a more difficult problem. But in 1986, because of this growing pressure from the US public, 1986, the Congress enacted sanctions against South Africa. And we decided that we really had to make a big push on that. We sent the first Black ambassador to South Africa, Edward Perkins. We sent other African-American staff members to both Cape Town and Pretoria. And we kept talking about moving away from apartheid. Now, we were quite surprised in 1989 when I had a private conversation with F.W. de Klerk, who was the new leader of the Afrikaner Party, who told me that when they got elected, and he got elected president, they would begin ending apartheid. So that was a great victory for us. And of course, then you had the Portuguese colonies, and there my predecessor, Assistant Secretary Chester Crocker, began this marathon negotiation to bring about the independence of Namibia and the departure of Cuban troops. So I can say with confidence that the United States played a major role in ending white minority rule in South Africa. Okay, now under G.H.W. Bush, when I was Assistant Secretary, we made a big push for conflict resolution in Mozambique, Angola, and Ethiopia. Now, for this, I give credit to Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev, I remember going down to George Bush liked to have conferences with Gorbachev. They were very friendly. And he liked to have summit conferences in Houston, Texas. So I got a call from Secretary Baker at one point. He said, they want to see you, Shevardnadze, and I want to see you. So I went down there and we talked about conflict. And they said that Presidents Gorbachev and Bush would like us to take the lead in trying to bring about resolutions of conflict in Ethiopia and Angola. And of course, we launched into that. I saluted and said, okay. And we launched into that, and we were very happy to achieve results in both Angola and Ethiopia in June 1991, when both wars were ended then. And in 1992, the Mozambique War was ended. Okay, so the question was, what about economic development? Well, the Africans were making very little progress. Now, when you talk about economic growth for developing countries, you're talking about the need for 12 to 15% annual growth. When you talk about people are now saying, oh, look at Ghana, they're doing well. They had 6% growth this year. Well, for a country at that level, it is not enough. It's not like Singapore or Malaysia or Indonesia when they were moving ahead rapidly. They were doing 15% a year. So Africa was making very, very little progress. So the question is, what do we do about economic development? Very little of what we had tried before had worked. Congress was getting nervous with all these appropriations. And then we started to get some creative projects in various administrations. The Clintons had the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which by the way, did not start with the Clinton administration. It started with members of Congress, mainly Republicans. And the African Growth and Opportunity Act said, well, if we give the Africans the opportunity to sell to us whatever they produce, duty-free, that will attract investors. And to a certain extent, it did attract investors in some countries. Then you had G.W. Bush, whom a lot of Africans say was our favorite American president. G.W. Bush started the PEPFAR, which put a halt to the spread of HIV. And he started the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which said, let's pick those countries which meet certain criteria and give them large amounts of money and really build things up in those countries, like the port system or the road system or the telecommunications system. And that has been a very successful program. And then you had Obama, who had two important programs called Feed the Future and Power Africa. Now, Feed the Future has not gotten very far. The one project that I saw was a great success was Nigeria, where they're now producing 50 million tons a year of manioc because of that. And that's a very big project because it feeds people and livestock. And then Power Africa has been a huge success because you really can't do anything toward economic development unless there's electric power. And this has not invested in electric power, but has helped various private sector companies invest in electric power so that there's been at least 200,000 new megawatts in Africa because of Power Africa. I personally, working for a US company called Contour Global, negotiated 5 power plants private plants: Togo, Rwanda, Senegal, and three in Nigeria. That's 6. And I remember going into Obama's summit conference with Africans in his last year in office. I sneaked in with Contour Global, which was invited because he invited a whole lot of American companies. And he really laid it into the Africans. He said, you're not going to get anywhere unless you stop the corruption. You stop diverting all of that government revenue to the party, on people in the political party. Otherwise, it'll just, as Senator Helm says, money down a rat hole. And I was very proud of President Obama for saying that. It's something that was never said in public or not even in private by his predecessors. Okay, so then President Trump comes in, and nothing really changes with him. Now, I was expecting, because he had a policy of reversing everything that President Obama did, I expected him to get rid of Power Africa and Feed the Future, but he didn't. And the one policy statement that came out of the Trump administration was from John Bolton, who made a speech at the American Enterprise Institute, and it was devoted exclusively to Africa. And he says, our big problem in Africa is China. They're in there big, they're putting in lots of investments, giving lots of aid, and we have to compete with them. And the way we compete with them is through promotion of US private investors. And he said, we're going to start a new program called Prosper Africa, and which in effect has been started. There's a bureaucracy in USAID, and they call it deal making. We're going to try to get Americans, we're going to look for deals that American companies can do in Africa, and we're going to promote that. I don't see too much that's happened so far, but they're serious about it, and they're working hard looking for US opportunities for the private sector. Okay, now, what is the outlook? I would say that Africa's biggest problem is the absence of indigenous private sector investors. You cannot get development through strictly foreign investors, which is important, which is useful. But when the local guy is not investing, there's a problem. And why is that not happening in Africa, except for a couple of exceptions like Nigeria or maybe Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana? They're keeping their money out of the country, and the World Bank estimates it could be as much as $1 trillion. They're keeping the money out of the country because it's hard to invest if you're not a member of the political power structure. The African who is successful in investing in enterprise in Africa, who is not part of the power structure, is seen as an enemy of power. This is the opposite of Southeast Asia, where the local entrepreneur is seen as a partner in development by the Southeast Asian government. But in Africa, if you're not part of that, power structure, they don't like you. They're afraid of you. And until they get rid of this mentality of if you're not with us in the power structure, we don't trust you. We don't trust you. And so until the Africans bring that money home and invest it in enterprises, I think Africa will stagnate, or will be just above stagnation and not getting very far, and frustrating the international community that is trying to help them. Okay, why don't I stop there? And by the way, I think the Trump policy is a continuity. There's nothing changing very much, and I think you should get credit for that, because the policy has been generally pretty good. Okay, why don't I stop there and have your comments and questions?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Cohen, for those introductory remarks. Again, we'll open the floor. If you'd like to use the chat box, we'd welcome any questions to continue the discussion. I'd just like to take a moment then to follow on with what you were saying toward the end. You see the Trump administration as being, just a continuity. do you see in the event that that there's a Biden administration? Do you see any major differences, given that they tend to be generally, regardless of the administration, the policy tends to be the same? But what are your thoughts regarding any potential differences?
Yeah, well, something I should have mentioned earlier, throughout the time since the 1950s, U.S. policy in Africa has been bipartisan. Really, there hasn't been much argument. I've never seen one administration criticized in Congress by the opposite party about their Africa policy, except maybe for a while, some of the left-wing members of Congress, what Howard Wolpe and Solars, were criticizing us for not moving against apartheid for a while. But in general, it's been bipartisan. I think if Biden is elected, it'll be the same. Not much change. At least I haven't seen any new ideas from that side.
And you mentioned early on, of course, with your experience, you mentioned the conversation with de Klerk and the situation with apartheid and playing a role really in our policy. And there's an interesting vignette of you as part of our Tales of American Diplomacy through ADST, where you kind of had to guard the secret, which we found very interesting. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see the legacy of colonialism in Africa in terms of how the British or the French involvement had an effect in the way U.S. policy, if any, the way U.S. policy evolved, and how that relates to today. There's been a more recent, it seems, movement towards whether it's Belgium or France or the UK involvement in Africa. What might that mean, if anything, for the United States?
Well, I think the Africans were very smart to keep close ties with the former colonial powers. They send their students there. They get all sorts of benefits from their former colonial powers. They get help when they need it militarily, as Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso are getting help now because of the Islamic terrorism in the Sahel. So they were very wise to stay close to the colonial, plus the fact that they had the colonial education, they continued that. So I think that the overall impact of the continued ties with the ex-colonialists has been rather positive, in my view. Now, the Belgians had some special problems with the Congo because of King Leopold and what he did. Maybe I should give back my decoration with King Leopold II, which the Belgians gave me. But even there, I think the Belgians are doing quite a lot of good things in the private investment side and in the security side. I think the Belgians are generally pretty well liked in the Congo, despite what happened under King Leopold. So I would say overall, generally, the ex-colonial African relationships are generally very positive.
We have a question in from Alan Henderson, who asks, what is the role of the U.S. Africa Command? Can it contribute to development as well as security? And if so, where in particular, in concert with USAID, the UN, the EU? What are your thoughts about U.S. Africa Command?
I'm glad you brought that up because I should have during my presentation. The history of U.S. military relations with Africa, I think, has been pretty constructive. One thing that President Eisenhower said that I didn't mention, he said, well, Nixon predicted, because of his various travels, he said there's going to be a lot of instability in Africa, especially tribal problems. So Eisenhower said, no NATO boots on the ground. In addition to saying we will not use the Cold War, he said, no NATO boots on the ground. Now, at one point, he panicked on that because when Congo became independent, it fell apart immediately because of the way the Belgians had failed to prepare. And Lumumba was being surrounded by Soviet diplomats. And Eisenhower panicked. He says, we can't let this major African country go to the communists. So he sent an order to Supreme Commander, Allied forces in Europe, and he said, prepare to send NATO troops to Congo. And Nixon said, he said, please, boss, don't do that. Remember, we said no NATO troops on the ground. That resulted in the first UN peacekeeping operation in the world that was run from New York. We went to the UN and said, look, this is, you got to do this. And Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the Secretary General, he organized a fantastic peacekeeping operation. I remember when I was, and this lasted several years. I remember when I was administrative officer in Kampala, I got all these calls. US Air Force are bringing 500 Ethiopian troops to the UN peacekeeping operation in the Eastern Congo. They're going to overnight in Kampala. Can you provide fuel and that sort of thing? So I was spending a lot of time getting involved in this peacekeeping operation, even though I was not in the Congo. It was a major thing. And okay, so this was a way of the US getting involved militarily. And after that, there were occasional operations of US military, but there was no one place they could come from. They were coming from Europe, they were coming from the United States, and there were different commands. I remember when I was at the US Embassy in Kinshasa as chargé d'affaires, we were helping them with left-wing rebels coming in from Tanzania. And we had 2 C-130s with crews, and their only job was to transport Congolese troops to places they were needed. And every night we would talk about tomorrow's mission, and we would get them there. And these guys came from something called Comid East 4, which was down in Tampa. So at one point, a decision was made that maybe we need a command just for Africa, because there was a command for Europe, there was a command for the Pacific area, for the Middle East. And Africa was divided up in several commands. You had the European Command, which had most of the countries. You had the Middle East Command, which had the Horn of Africa. And you had Pacific Command, which had Madagascar and the Comoro Islands. I remember the head of the Middle East Command, General Schwarzkopf, when I was Assistant Secretary, he gave me a call and says, can we talk? I said, sure. He said, okay, I'm sending my plane to pick you up, flying me down to Tampa. Okay, I go down there, we have lunch, and he says, I have a request. He says, under my command, I have Kenya, I have Tanzania, I have Ethiopia. I want Uganda also. So he was making an appeal for me to transfer Uganda from the European Command to the Middle East Command. And then he flew me back. So that's the way the military operated. So finally, a decision was made that maybe because of the growing interest and the growing need, that maybe we should have a single command for Africa. I forgot what year it was started, but the Africa Command, and it was placed in Stuttgart. And I think that was a wise decision not to place it in Africa because of the transportation problems and other countries being jealous and that sort of thing. So the African Command is doing well, I think, and they're keeping a fairly low profile, which is good. And they're also engaged in civic action. I remember going to, during a visit to the Congo, and I saw a new school was being dedicated. So the embassy, come on, and you can cut the ribbon. And I go there, and there were these guys from AFRICOM, and they said they're the ones who paid for it. They built it. So they did, in addition to military stuff, they're doing a lot of good civic action stuff.
Well, we have a few questions that have come in, and one concerns democratic principles from Mike Scarlatos. He thanks you for your interesting comments, but concerning the export of democratic principles, he says it's clear many African countries struggle implementing these principles. Is there a piecemeal approach where the export of these principles can be sequenced? What are your thoughts on that regarding democratic values?
It's an interesting proposal. I think when it comes to democracy, I think Africans have a cultural problem. You know, there's, I recommend a book by the late Professor Huntington of Harvard. He wrote a book called Culture Matters. He didn't write the book, he edited it. And you had people from every continent writing chapters. And the chapter on Africa says there's a real cultural problem with democracy because the people don't think in terms of national terms. They think of their local ethnicity mainly. And so when a leader gets up in the morning, he says, he doesn't say, what am I going to do for my people? He says, what am I going to do for my ethnic group today? And it's hard for them to get out of that syndrome. And therefore that makes democracy very difficult. But in some places they're getting there. I saw a definition of democracy, which I like very much. Democracy has become irreversible if there are 3 transfers of power from one administration to another, and it's peaceful. And so there are not many African countries who've had that. I think Ghana has had it. Well, of course, South Africa has always been a special case. Botswana's had it, Namibia's had it, and Ghana. I can't think of any French-speaking countries that have had it yet. So it's a question of a cultural acceptance, and the majority of African countries haven't reached that point yet. But there's nothing wrong with our continuing to promote it, to provide assistance. If you want assistance with having an election, that's why we have the International Republican Institute. We have the National Democratic Institute. They're available to help out. And I think slowly but surely, African countries are going to get to that point where they will have peaceful transfers of power based on democratic elections. I think eventually they'll get there as you have new generations of Africans coming out of university, coming out of high school, who want to go in that direction. But it's a slow process.
Well, Ambassador, you did mention that the outlook for Africa is unfortunately one of potential stagnation if there isn't, indigenous investment. We had a question from Leslie Arrieti, which is somewhat related, and she asks, what is the impact of continued rapid population growth on Africa's future? Do you see that as something that's going to be a big challenge?
It's a tremendous challenge, and I'm glad the question came up. Well, Africa is making progress. I think at the time of independence, the birth rate was 8 children per mother in most of Africa. Now, thanks to all sorts of projects, programs, USAID, family planning projects, making birth control equipment available, the birth rate now is about 5 children per mother. Still much too high, So that's so with the population growing so fast, I think you're talking about 2 billion people now. And I think that's going to go up to 2.5 by 2050. It's tremendous burden on the education system, tremendous burden on the health system. And it's very important that they slow that down. What the United States can do is just continue to do family planning. And also, it's very important to educate the girls. Now, normally when an African family says, oh, we only have so much money, we can't send every child to school, they'll send the boys, right? By the way, the Democratic Republic of the Congo did something very important just now. They made elementary school education free for everybody. Until then, everybody had to pay the teacher, and therefore you couldn't send every child to school. Now, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, every child doesn't have to pay. They can go to school. So if you educate girls, and this has been documented, an educated girl will have fewer children and she'll have healthier children. So one of the things that has to be done is more girls being educated, you see. And of course, making available birth control information and equipment when needed and what have you.
There's a question related that has just come in regarding that more generally about women. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on women, peace, and security in Africa. You mentioned educating young girls, but how do you see the important role of women as well in Africa? And how can U.S. policy play a role?
Yeah, well, women can play an important role. I'm seeing now in Cameroon, for example, Cameroon is suffering a very bad civil war right now because about 25% of the people speak English and 75% of the people speak French. And the English portion is in a state of rebellion because the French side, which controls the government, has been invading their culture, insisting that they speak French, sending French teachers instead of English-speaking teachers and what have you. And generally trying to destroy the Anglophone culture in Cameroon. So they're in a state of armed rebellion and there's a war going on. And I note that the women there are working very hard to try and find a solution. They're taking the lead in looking for mediation and trying to bring about conflict resolution. And I think generally in Africa, they do a much better job than the men on that side. And that's why I think we should promote more education, not just for girls, but continuing education. I've been going, during my travels in Africa, I would frequently go to literacy training. I like to go see that. And there are always women with babies on their backs, just dying to learn how to read and write. And that always brought tears to my eyes when I saw that. So I think the women are really playing an important role in conflict mitigation and conflict avoidance in Africa.
Absolutely. Well, we're turning to a different subject now. A question came in from Alan Easton about China in particular. And you mentioned this, China, in your presentation. And his question is, why would we, the United States, decide to compete with China at this time, given that we declined to do so when their push into Africa commenced over a decade ago? The question is it shifting US attitudes or has something changed? How do you see that, the inherent competition that may or may not exist with China in Africa?
Well, historically, there was a major difference between the Mao Zedong time and the post-Mao time. During Mao Zedong, I remember Chu Enlai, who was basically the #2 in China, did a tour of Africa. This was in the, I think, early 1980s. And, no, I'm sorry, 1970s. He visited all the top leaders and he gave a press conference in Dar es Salaam on his way out. And he said, all these African leaders, they're just bourgeoisie, just like they're Europeans. They're useless, you know. What Africa needs is a revolution. Now, this is the Maoist view, you know, have a cultural revolution. It scared the hell out of all these African leaders. They didn't want to have anything to do with China from that point on. But post-Mao, when you got Deng Xiaoping, he said, let's have investors, let's go in there. And of course, there have been many investments and much loans to Africa. Now, China's basic view of Africa is for their economic growth, spectacular economic growth, they need commodities. And Africa has the commodities. Some of these commodities are available only in Africa, like cobalt and lithium and tantalum. And they need crude oil. So the Chinese said, we'll give us assured quantities. We'll pay world prices. Give us 200,000 barrels a day, Congo, Brazzaville, and we'll pay the price. And in return, we'll give you soft loans for infrastructure. You want roads, you want bridges, you want dams, we'll give you soft loans. So they've built up these relationships over the years, but there have been big problems. First of all, Africa has become heavily indebted with these soft loans. They can't pay it back. See, this is a big problem for both sides. China uses state-owned companies to do these projects, and some are good and some are bad. I know a company in Texas called Roth Construction. They're making a lot of money now repairing Chinese runways at Chinese-built airports because they do shoddy work sometimes. The road from Kinshasa to the port of Matadi washed out in 3 years that the Chinese built. You see? So what about the American view of China in Africa? Well, I don't see that we're competing with them. China is a problem for Africans to manage. And Africans don't really understand that all the time. Some do. First of all, the Chinese brought their own workers to begin with. So a lot of African countries said, hey, that's no good. We have workers too. So a lot of countries like Ethiopia, and they put quotas. You want to bring workers? 10%, that's maximum. Secondly, how do you treat workers? An American company in Africa, wait 5 years and you'll see Africans in management positions. Go to Chevron, Angola, one of the biggest companies in Africa. You say, I want to see the CEO. Okay, he's a Nigerian. The chief of Chevron in Angola is a Nigerian. Was he there? He's a 35-year veteran of Chevron. He's worked all over the world. And this is what you see in American companies. Africans going into management, Africans being well treated. I was teaching at Johns Hopkins for a while, and I had a student who had traveled to Africa just to look at China, what China's doing. And she was in a factory there, and she saw the workers were being very badly treated. So she went to the manager and said, look, why do you treat these workers that way? You know, they can't even get bathroom breaks and all that stuff. And they said, well, we treat them like we treat our own workers in China. You see, we're giving equal treatment to the Africans. So but the Africans are starting to manage better. Another problem, for example, is when an African Chinese state-owned company finishes its job, a lot of the Chinese don't go home. They go into rural areas and they start retail, and they compete with locals, and they undermine local industries. They import Chinese goods, and local industries are. So it's another thing that the Africans have to manage, and we have to encourage the Africans, you know, get tougher with the Chinese. You like what they're doing, but you know, not all of it is positive. But I don't think the Americans, like John Bolton said, we got to compete with China. I don't see that. I think it's a problem for Africans to manage. I don't see any threats to U.S. interest, except where what they do undermines, say, some of our aid programs. But I haven't seen any of that yet.
Well, we had a follow-on question that was regarding it. You know, is there a possibility for the establishment and the maintenance of strong institutions in Africa? And in this particular instance, he's wondering, this is from James Fowler, an insightful question, is there anything that can be used to counter, for example, the Chinese willingness to openly support corruption? You mentioned, you know, the workers, they're coming in on infrastructure projects. In some cases, there is corruption. Do you see that as a threat to the United States? Or, as you mentioned, is it something just that African colleagues and partners will just have to manage?
Yeah, I don't see that as a threat to the United States. Corruption, of course, is a problem with or without the Chinese. I note that something I'm getting involved in myself now is the fairly new president of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, knowing how much money has been diverted from the Congo treasury to private pockets. He is setting up a anti-corruption commission, and he's coming to us for technical advice and various other types of advice. And I think this is a coming trend. When I went up to Canada to sell the French version of one of my books, I was sitting next to a retired Congolese central bank official. He decided to live in Canada. And I said to him, "Are you getting your retirement pension?" And he said, "Are you kidding me?" He says, "You can't get your retirement pension from the Congo." What happened was that when I retired, the governor of the central bank gave me a package, and I invested it, and I'm living off the proceeds of that package. So anti-corruption I think, is just beginning in Africa, but still much too much money is being diverted from its proper use. And in fact, my bottom line is Africa is not really moving ahead because of corruption, really. Sometimes I kid around and I say, well, in Southeast Asia, corruption of government revenues, maximum 20%, they could live with that. But in Africa, this guy I met in Canada, who was from the central bank, I said, "What is the rate of corruption that you saw?" He said, "The money coming from copper earnings," which was the big export of Congo, where they make most of the money. He said 60% was not going into the proper channels, into the budget or the central bank. So my bottom line is, until they can manage this diversion of national resources, Africa is stagnating. They're not going to get ahead. And I think this is happening still in the majority of countries, especially in places like Nigeria.
Well, there was another question that follows on this topic of just institutions, and it's from Tom Hull, and he asks about the African Union has become much more assertive than its predecessor, the OAU, in terms of continental relations and peacekeeping. And the United States is much more engaged with the African Union than the OAU. How do you see the evolution of this relationship?
Well, we believe in the African Union to the extent that we have an ambassador accredited uniquely to that. There are two ambassadors in Addis Ababa, one to Ethiopia and one to the African Union, and we're putting a lot of effort into helping them with their administration. And one thing that African Union has been good at is to go against military coups. And as soon as there's a civilian government that's overthrown, whether it's democratic or semi-democratic or non-democratic, they go right in there and say, you can't do this. You got to stop this, bring about a civilian regime. They're working hard right now in Burkina Faso and in Mali. Get back to civilian rule. I think they deserve a lot of credit for that. And they're also promoting democracy. If an African country decides to go ahead with a decent election, the African Union will be up there with lots of help, lots of assistance. So I think they're worth supporting, and they're doing a constructive role generally.
Well, thank you for that. I think we have time for a couple more questions, and one that's come in that may be of interest kind of follows on your conclusion that generally foreign affairs tends to be bipartisan. And Greg Garland specifically for African affairs, and this in particular from Greg Garland, he's saying, would you say Africa is one area of foreign affairs that remains largely bipartisan? But why? Why is that, in your opinion?
Well, there's, I guess, neither within the Republican and Democratic parties, Africa's never presented a sort of a special interest. You see, I remember when President Clinton decided that Poland would be brought into NATO. And I remember having a big argument with people. Why is he doing that? Poland, if we bring Poland into NATO, we're going to have big problems with the Soviet Union. We don't need that. But it turned out that he did it for the Polish vote in the Chicago area, you see. So it's easy to play politics with most areas of the world except Africa. You see, Africa has no real constituency in the United States. The African diaspora is becoming a constituency more and more now, and they're getting in touch with Congress and that sort of thing. The African Americans, I do not see as a constituency for Africa. They have their own interests, which is mainly within the United States. You don't see, of course, there's a lot of sympathy for Africa in the African American community, but it's really the diaspora. I remember when I was assistant secretary, I used to do a lot of public speaking within the US. And wherever I went, I got contacted by the Liberian community. Got to have dinner with us after your speech. Got to have dinner with us. The diaspora is very active, but not the Americans. So there is no domestic political issue with Africa. That's why it's bipartisan.
Okay, we have a question, another question about institutions, and this one from Artemis Katsaris about the EU. And what are your thoughts on the European Union's policy towards Africa, particularly their funding towards Africa and their focus on the Sahel? Any thoughts about the EU?
When I think about the EU and Africa, I say, thank God for the EU. Because, you know, there's a lot of people in the UK and France say, oh, look, why are we bothering in Africa? We gave them their independence. No, there's tremendous interest there, and they want to help. And of course, the French sent troops, which they didn't like to do. They don't like getting involved with combat in Africa. So because of the EU, I think the Americans have less to worry about Africa. You know, it's not, Africa is not going to become a source of threat to American national interest, most likely, as long as the EU is in there doing its best. I can see areas like in Somalia where there's shipping problems, pirating and that sort of thing. And I say, because look at France has a base in Djibouti. We've been using that base for 30 years because of our Indian Ocean interests. So again, I say, if not for the EU in Africa, we'd have a lot more problems we'd have to cope with of a security interest in the United States that they are handling instead of us.
Right. But we have one point I wanted to add from Greg Garland. He disagrees on one point, and that's that white evangelicals in the United States have become a major voice and constituency for Africa within the Republican Party. What are your thoughts regarding that constituency and how that might evolve over time?
Yes, well, there is a growing community of evangelicals in Africa in various countries. So they naturally want to support them. I remember there was a president of Cote d'Ivoire named Gbagbo, and he and his wife, his former wife, were fervent evangelicals. And when there was a problem there, and there was civil war starting, and all sorts of problems, I saw that Mrs. Gbagbo was coming. I used to see Gbagbo a lot when he traveled, and Mrs. Gbagbo was going to Texas all the time. She stopped in Washington to rest up between flights, and then she was going to see the evangelicals, saying, "You got to help us in Cote d'Ivoire." And the evangelicals were calling me and other people in the State Department, "Why can't we help this guy?" So wherever there is strong evangelical community in Africa, and there's growing numbers now, especially in Nigeria, the American evangelicals will keep in touch with them and try to help them. It's international solidarity, which I think is quite natural, just like American Jews support Israel. It's the same thing. By the way, the Catholics are also becoming very strong, and I would call them Catholic evangelicals, in the sense that very aggressive. And go to Nigeria, you'll see they're very aggressive in converting people and expanding their influence. So evangelicalism is a big thing in Africa, whether it's Protestant or Catholic.
Sure is. Well, we're coming up to the end of our time. I just wanted to thank you again on behalf of ADST, Ambassador Cohen. This has been a great discussion. There's certainly a lot more that we could discuss, and this is part of the goal of this regular series, is to be able to engage in these discussions and look at our history and learn from it and chart the way forward. So thank you so much for taking this time to join us. And Please join us again, everybody. The coming virtual diplomatic luncheon will be the last Thursday in October. That's the 29th at 12:30 Eastern. We'll have Andrew Imbrie talking about national security. So thank you very much. That concludes the official portion, but you're welcome to, anyone's welcome to stay on and say hello as we finish the official portion as we normally do. Thank you again.